All right, so after you've done this, after you've gone through all of your sections and made revisions, now you can come back and start to edit. So you can start to edit for grammar, edit for spelling mistakes, if there are any still remaining, and edit for style. So here's your editing checklist. First, ask yourself, is the grammar and technical style, such as person, voice, tense, pronouns, prepositions, articles, is this all correct? Is the word location correct? Such as, is the verb following the subject? Or did you put the old and short information at the beginning of a sentence? Have you removed unnecessary items, redundancies, and jargon, for example? Are the non-technical words and phrases that you are using, are those simple? They should be. So don't overcomplicate things. Don't try to use fancy language when it's not necessary. Just go ahead and use simple language, plain language. That's fine. In fact, that's better than using fancy and flowery language. Have you found all of those spelling and punctuation errors? Are comparisons written correctly? And so in this case, we're not talking about compare and contrast to previous work. We're talking about comparisons, well, it could be, but we're mainly talking about comparisons within a sentence, such as our results are similar to results from Smith et al. 2012. That is a correct comparison, but an incorrect comparison would be something like, our results are similar to Smith et al. 2012. So you're comparing results to people. That's not a good comparison. So you need to compare results to results. Have you eliminated and resolved any noun clusters? So noun clusters are a series of nouns that are strung together, and it's really hard to read those. Are transitions used, and do they make sense? Is the action in the verbs? Have you avoided nominalizations? So if you don't know what a nominalization is, go ahead and look that up. And if you find them in your work at this stage, this is the time to change the sentences around so that you're using verbs as verbs instead of nouns as verbs. Also ask yourself, is sentence length varied, and do you have one idea per sentence? And then also at this stage, you need to verify the format and the completeness of the references that you have cited. So way back in the lesson when we talked about finding and citing references, I mentioned that in your reference managing software, you might have to make some corrections because certain sources of citations are not formatted correctly. For example, Google Scholar, I have noticed, is often very bad about capitalizing all the words of the name of a journal. You might have a journal such as the Journal of Experimental Biology, and only the word journal is capitalized. They don't have experimental or biology capitalized, but they should be. So you'll have to go in and make that correction. So look at all of your references, make sure they're all correct. If they're not, correct that in your database. Now, some of these things that I've talked about here, if you want to learn more about those, then you can take my other course on scientific writing skills. So it's a complement to this course. It's not required to do this editing, but if you want to do a really great job of editing, that's a course that's going to help you make your writing the best it can possibly be. All right, so now you have revised your manuscript, you have edited your manuscript. This is the time to send it to your co-authors. And so your co-authors will give you their suggestions. They'll probably do some revisions themselves, and they'll probably do some edits themselves. And then they'll send it back to you. And you may have to do this process 3 or 4 times, or maybe even more. So just be prepared for that. It's very rare to just do one round of revisions and edits and be done. You'll typically do several rounds. This is also the time that if you can, if your work is not something that's too proprietary or you need to keep it completely secret, this is a good time to have your manuscript reviewed by 1 or 2 people who are not involved in the project. So some friends of yours who are willing to do you a favor, or some colleague. And if they're friends of yours and they're in a slightly different field and they don't understand the science, that's okay. Actually, that might even be better, because then they'll be reading it for a different purpose than somebody who's in your field. So that person who's in a different field is going to notice different things that the person who's in your same field and is going to read it for the scientific aspects, they might miss some of the writing aspects. And when you give your paper to these outside reviewers, ask them to be critical of it in a constructive way, of course. So constructive criticism is going to help you because it might prepare you to make some changes that reviewers would have picked up on if you had submitted it without this constructive criticism. Now, one important thing I want to mention is take all of the comments very seriously. I've seen a lot of writers, they'll get a comment from somebody and they'll just say, oh, well, that person just didn't understand what I was saying. And that's exactly right. They didn't understand what you were saying, but don't blame them. If they don't understand what you're saying, it's because you didn't write it as well as you could have. So take that criticism very seriously and think, try to step back into the reader's position and see it from their point of view. And then that will help you revise and edit so that those kinds of questions don't come up. Okay, so you've had your paper reviewed by your co-authors and you've had it reviewed by some outside reviewers. Now it's time to prepare for submitting it to your target journal. All right, we're almost there. So the first thing you want to do is make sure that all of the authors have approved the final version. Get their specific approval. Yes, it is ready to submit. You want that in writing, if at all possible, by email, for example. Make sure the manuscript is formatted to the journal's specifications. So they're going to tell you how to structure the title page. They're going to tell you where to put the figure legends, if that's going to be with the figures or if it's going to be in the manuscript after the references. They'll tell you all of those different formatting things that you have to do. So make sure you have those instructions and you followed them. Number 3, write a compelling cover letter to the associate editor. And we'll talk about more details about the cover letter soon. Number 4, you will upload all of the files to the journal's submission portal. It might take several hours to do this upload. So be prepared for that. Set yourself up with a big block of time so that you don't get interrupted. I used to do it in the evenings or on the weekend because there were fewer people around that would come into my office and ask me questions during that time. And number 5, only submit to your target journal. Don't submit to multiple journals at the same time. And by the same time, I don't just mean the same day. I mean, if you're waiting for 5 or 6 weeks for a decision from one journal, you cannot submit your paper to another journal during that time. You have to wait until you have a final decision. And if that final decision is a rejection, then at that point you can submit to a second journal, but not at the same time. If you do submit to multiple journals at the same time, they're going to find out, and then both or all of those journals is going to kick your paper out and you won't get it reviewed. So what about this cover letter to the associate editor? What is the purpose of that? So the purpose of the cover letter is kind of like the purpose of a title or an abstract. It's to get the associate editor interested in your paper and to show them that your paper is a good fit for their journal and that the readership of that journal will be interested in your paper. If the associate editor feels like all of that is true, then they will send the paper into the peer review process. So how do you write this cover letter? Let's look at an example of instructions from the journal New Phytologist. So they say that authors should include answers to the following questions with a maximum of 50 words per question in a covering letter to help editors decide whether to send the manuscript for peer review. And those questions are: what hypotheses or questions does this work address? How does this work advance our current understanding of plant science? Why is this work important and timely? So I think this is a really great template for a cover letter to any journal. So if you're not doing plant science, let's say you are in microbiology, just switch out the words in the second bullet point from plant science to microbiology. This slide is here as a reminder for the decisions that might come out of the review process. And just be prepared for that. You're probably going to have to address reviewer comments. And we already talked about in an earlier lesson addressing the reviewer comments and how to do that. Congratulations! Once you have done all of these steps, you are ready to submit your manuscript. After you submit, I think this is a great time to celebrate and reward yourself because you've reached an important milestone. Even though you haven't got the decision yet, still, this is a really big milestone. It's a big step in the process. You've written your entire paper, you've revised it, you've edited it, you've submitted it. Yeah, it's time to take a little, victory lap. Get an ice cream cone or a pizza or, however you like to reward yourself. Have a movie night, go to the park, whatever you think is a good reward. So that concludes the lesson on revising, editing, and submitting. This is basically the end of the course. All right, so as you prepare to submit your journal article, I would say once again, happy writing.